Well, here we are. Okay, and what's happened is the House committee has released its testimony with the Fusion GPS. This is the Senate released theirs the other day, or actually Dianne Feinstein released it on our behalf. And since then, Adam Schiff has been asking for the same thing on the Senate side, since he's on the committee and knows what's there and all. Well, they released it today, I don't know, in the last couple hours, I guess, and kind of reading through it, and I thought it might be interesting to share the stuff that I'm reading as I read through it. So Schiff is talking to Simpson. That's Glenn Simpson. Glenn Simpson is the guy. He runs Fusion GPS, like I said, now, but he worked at the Wall Street Journal until like 2009, and then he co-founded this research business, Fusion GPS. He's written a couple of books a while back, and he runs this Fusion GPS, and it's a company that does research for politicians. Something called Oppo research is real common, and that's opposition research. Basically, before you go up in front of, before you go up against someone as a candidate, or even as yourself as a candidate, you want to run opposition research. You want someone to go through third party and take a good look at what your candidate or what the other candidate, you kind of want to know both, look like, if the media were to find some skeleton in their closet. And that's what opposition research does. And most in real big campaigns like presidential elections and stuff, they run them not only on the people they're running against, but also on themselves, because they want to know where their liabilities are in that, along those lines. And so there you go. I guess I'm just going to jump right into it. Let me pull up the wording here. Okay, so Adam Schiff he's a senator talking to Mr. Simpson. So during the period of time you're working for the Free Beacon, which is a DC-based conservative newspaper, you came across some of the first information about candidate Trump's business ties in Russia, including those with Felix Sater. Mr. Simpson: Yep, that's correct. And lots of other issues came up during the primaries that raised concerns in my mind about whether there might be connections. Donald Trump might have unexplained connections to Russia or people involved in that part of the world. I mean, among other things, eventually Paul Manafort was appointed to his campaign as first the convention manager and then the chairman, or the campaign manager. And I knew a lot about Paul Manafort from my career with the Wall Street Journal. I'd written a number of stories about his involvement with Oleg Deripaska. That's one of the oligarchs. We'll say, quote, the oligarchs, unquote. And these are the wealthy Russians who are in the middle of all this stuff. Okay, I'd written a number of stories with his involvement with Oleg Deripaska and the pro-Russian party in the Ukraine, and other oligarch named Firtash. I've even written a story about whether he should have been registered as a foreign agent. So then they go on, Mr. Schiff. So if you would go through and tell us some of the Russia-related things that concerned you, that you learned in that first phase while you were doing work for the Free Beacon, as best you can recall. Mr. Simpson replies: Well, the funding of Bayrock was, I think, much of what we initially were concerned about and focused on. The company seemed to have some sort of funding source from either Russia or the former Soviet Union that was opaque. So we spent a lot of time looking at the people around that and their backgrounds and why Mr. Trump would be in business with them. So that was one of the major issues. Another one I think surfaced in probably the early winter was an amazing number of people from the former Soviet Union who had purchased properties from Mr. Trump, including Dmitry Rybolovlev, I'm sure I butchered that name a little, who purchased a derelict estate at an extreme markup in Florida. I seem to remember it being like $60 million markup or something. That's me editorializing. Okay, back to the thing here. And a number of other people bought into his properties. We also looked at his trips, marketing activities in Russia, and I think all that came up, during the first phase of the project. I'm editorializing here. If I remember right, it took Steele like 2 days to come up with a lot of the Oppo stuff. The stuff is just there wherever I'm going to find it. Okay, back to the thing again here, and here comes something interesting. So Mr. Simpson goes on. I guess the general thing I would say is that the Russians are far more sophisticated in their criminal organized crime activities than the Italians. And they're a lot more global. Oh, here he's talking about there are redacted parts, and I'm skipping pages. How the Russians took over the Italian mafia in the U.S. years ago, decades ago. So going back to the thing here, Mr. Simpson. I guess the general thing I would say is that, Russians are far more sophisticated in their criminal organized crime activities than the Italians. And they're a lot more global. They understand finance a lot better, so they tend to use quite elaborate methods to move money. Obviously the offshore system has grown in sophistication in the last decade or so they've taken advantage of that. Things I had wrote about involved laundering money through security straits, laundering money through fake arbitrations in court, laundering money through commodities deals. I mean, if you can think of a way to launder money, the Russians are pretty good at it. But they specifically understand financial markets. So I think I can tell you all of that. I can tell you also the Russians are much more integrated in the way they operate with the sort of legitimate business structures. So you don't find too many Italian mafia guys who are the major shareholders in big media companies. Now get this. But you definitely can find Russian mafia guys who are big shareholders in international media companies. Let me read that one again. So you don't find too many Italian mafia guys who are major shareholders in big media companies, but you definitely can find Russian mafia guys who are big shareholders in international media companies. That's that's something that you either knew or didn't. Let's see, skip over some classified parts, talking about the condos, and the fact that there were selling H-5B visas, EB5, E5B5, B5. Okay, it's the EB-5. So it's coming out. This is coming out of a classified section that I can't read, obviously. ... Condos in order to get visas under the EB-5 program. So we were very familiar with a pattern of corruption and illicit finance related to purchasing of condos. Mr. Schiff asks, did you find evidence of that with respect to Mr. Trump? Mr. Simpson's reply, I think a lot of what we found is subsequently there have been similar articles published. Quote, evidence, I think, is a strong word. I think we saw patterns of buying and selling that we thought were suggestive of money laundering. So that's basically what they were doing, was selling these condos for, like way more money than they were worth because of the money laundering part. And in exchange, the foreigners would get a visa to come to America. The Jared Kushner family got in trouble for that shortly after the election. Let's go a little bit further here. Oh yeah, we're going to go into more of the gangster stuff here, I think. Oh, Trump Tower. Oh yeah, this is pretty good. Mr. Simpson goes on. There was, well, for one thing, there was various criminals who were buying the properties. So there was a gangster, a Russian gangster living in Trump Tower. Mr. Schiff, who was that? Mr. Simpson, his gangster name is Taiwanchik. I couldn't spell his actual name, but, these are the kind of things that prompted us to hire Mr. Steele. We had a gangster named Taiwanchik living in Trump Tower who had been under, I think he was running, we work into a redaction section here, he was running something that is classified still. Okay, coming out of that section, and his associates were living in Trump Tower, and he was running a high-stakes gambling ring out of Trump Tower, and while he himself was a fugitive for having rigged the skating competition at the Salt Lake Olympics and a bunch of other sporting events engaged in rigging. Okay, so we're talking about the Russian mafia now. He was dealing with the Italian mafia back in the 70s and 80s. Here we're going to go on. I think here comes more mafia stuff. Okay. Here we're back on Mr. Simpson Fusion GPS testifying again. And when Mr. Trump went to the Miss Universe pageant in 2013, Taiwanchik was there in the VIP section with Mr. Trump and lots of other Kremlin biggies. So that kind of thing raised questions with us. Generally speaking, the patterns of activity that we thought might be suggestive of money laundering were, fast turnover deals and deals where there seemed to have been efforts to disguise the identity of the buyer. Mr. Schiff, and during what time period did you see indications of fast turnover transactions or transactions made in the name of people who were not the actual purchasers? Mr. Simpson replies, well, there were sort of periods. What we saw was that beginning in the early 2000s, when he began to do business with Bayrock and do some of these other deals, that these were the problematic deals that he entered into. So it was essentially the previous decade of business deals, 2005 onward. Schiff. And did you see, I have to say here as a disclaimer, I'm skipping pages and reading sections that, that make sense to me, I guess. Okay, that are easy to find. Maybe that's it. Back to it again. Mr. Schiff, and did you see any money involved with those as well? Mr. Simpson, well, we had, we saw what Eric Trump said about Russian money being available for the golf course projects, making remarks about having unlimited sums available. And, because Mr. Trump's companies are generally not publicly traded and don't do a lot of public disclosure, we can only have a limited look into the financing of those projects. But because the Irish courses and the Scottish courses are under UK law, Anglo corporate law, they have financial statements. So we were able to get the financial statements, and they don't, on their face, show Russian involvement. What they do show is enormous amounts of capital flowing into these projects from unknown sources, or at least on paper it says it's from the Trump organization, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars. And these golf courses are just, they're sinks. They don't actually make any money. Let me flip through here. Okay. If people ... coming back into top of a page again. This is Simpson. So I'm sorry for the long answer, but essentially, if people who seem to be associated with the Russian mafia are buying Trump properties or arranging for other people to buy Trump properties, it does raise a question about whether they're doing it on behalf of the government. Mr. Schiff. Now, whether they're doing it on behalf of the government or they're doing it, whether they're doing it on behalf of the government, it would be your expert opinion that it could be known to the government if it's on Mr. Simpson. Certainly. Schiff goes on. Any substantial scale? Simpson. Certainly, yes. Schiff. Might that prevent the Russian government? Might that provide the Russian government leverage vis-a-vis now President Trump? Simpson, yes. So, back to Schiff. So if the president's son boasted some years ago they were getting lots of financing from Russia and that the financing were illicit, that would be known to the Kremlin. Simpson, yes, that's true. I think we had more specific reporting than that from Chris, and I think it's credible. Oh. Something. All these things. This is just more of the Fusion GPS guy Simpson going on. All these things caused a good bit of concern. I guess the other big one, was the Aglarovs. That's another oligarch family who seem to, be the central figures in the Trump-Russia relationship. And so we spent a lot of time looking at them. As sort of an amateur student of Russian oligarchs and criminals, I hadn't come across them before. So I thought, I at first didn't think they were that interesting. But as we've, learned more about them, it's become more troubling. I now know that the Aglarovs started operating in the United States around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union and are associated with people who are connected to previous episodes of money laundering that are serious, the bank and New York scandal. And they themselves, we found a case in tax court involving the Aglarovs that describes a lot of activity from that period and a criminal investigation of the Aglarovs from that period. Mr. Simpson. Because we've not had liberty to talk about all these things, there's been a lot of misconception about this whole process. So, it's a much broader project where we're not just looking at Russia and we're not just doing Russia stuff with Chris. We're doing our own Russia work. So, in addition to things like finding someone who can look into a Mexican, suit factory to see how they treat their workers, we're scanning Russian newspapers or newspapers all around the world for information about these subjects. I have staff who prepare white papers on various subjects. So without, being too specific about it, in terms of the work product, Chris's memos, I guess it would be helpful to explain. So Chris's memos are raw field memoranda. They're from interviews with his source network. I didn't tell him what to write, I didn't edit them. They're what came to me from him. And they're, to my knowledge, the only drafts. So ordinarily I take material like that I got from a subcontractor in the field, and I'd incorporate it into a more polished memorandum. And, my style is more journalistic style, so I'm not going to just give you what Tom, Joe, and Harry said. I'm going to say, here's what people said, and here is what we think that really means, what's really going on. It's a very analytical product, and, that's to the sort of guide the client's ability to make decisions. This sentence is kind of incredible. And in this case, the material that came in from Chris was of such a kind of disturbing and serious nature, I didn't want to do that. Let me read that again. In this case, the material that came in from Chris was of such a kind of disturbing and serious nature, I didn't want to do that. To take it and polish it up and you pass it along. He had to take it. He couldn't. Actually, let's see what he did with it. It's probably going to... I shouldn't be guessing what's going on, right? Okay, let me head back here again, and we're going to keep going. So, this is Simpson going on again. So, because, I'm an amateur student of a lot of this stuff, not a pro, here's another redacted area that's classified. And the line of reporting was, coming in from him was, extraordinary and not something I would usually be doing as a research person based in Washington, D.C. So I segregated that, and I never incorporated it into anything else. He didn't know what to do with it. That's interesting. Now, I think we get back into the EB5 stuff again here. So anyway, this is Simpson, the Fusion GPS guy again. So anyway, we looked at this Jersey City project, and it was going to be financed by selling visas to foreign citizens who were seeking green cards from the United States. And I knew from previous investigations that the program was that there are a lot of irregularities in that program, and that, in fact, the U.S. government had conducted previous investigations into whether foreign intelligence figures were using the EB-5 program to get people into the U.S. Okay, I'm going to do that again. The U.S. government had conducted previous investigations into whether foreign intelligence figures were using the EB-5 program to get people into the U.S. So if they if someone buys a condo from Trump, this is me, by the way, I'm editorializing here. So if someone buys a condo from Trump for an extra $60 million and gets a visa to come live in the U.S. out of it, then, I mean, it's double as bad. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm editorializing. Back to the document. Simpson. So in any event, we looked at all of that, and I don't believe we concluded we found any specific events of fraud, but it all took on the appearance of a controversial thing, which later became true. And in fact, it did become very controversial in that they were using EB-5 visas to fund that project. Okay, he's asked if he concludes that these are crimes. And Simpson responds, I think it's a great question. Essentially we ended up spending almost a year on this project. And as you know, it was because it's all private work in the sense of non-governmental, without any legal process to compel production of information, we can only reach a certain point. And at the time that Chris decided to take it to the FBI, I wasn't convinced of the facts of anything in terms of, I wasn't convinced that there was a specific crime that occurred. I thought it was a possible crime in progress, and there was possibly very serious crimes, but, I'm an ex-journalist, so I'm not really in a position to prove that anyone's engaged in crime. I mean, sometimes you do find proof of criminal activity in an investigation, but more often than not, you find things that are suggestive or raise questions. Congressman mentions that this is Rooney. We've moved on from Schiff now. Give me a second here, because you can only keep so much in your brain at a time. Thomas Rooney. Okay. Let me get back here again. It's Thomas Rooney from Florida, of course. Anyways. Maybe, right, that's exactly my point. This is Mr. Rooney. Right, that's exactly my point. And that if we knew that Donald Trump was working with the Russian mafia to fund Doonberg in Ireland, then there's no way he would be president. So, I mean, that's why it's so fascinating. And again, it might have been, but when you also add the caveat, but we didn't, quote unquote, there wasn't actually Russian names on the ledger or whatever, like that final step. And so, I'll equate that to the election as well as with your Oppo research and with the dossier and everything else. Do you know with what you found or what Mr. Seal found, that we got to the point where we could conclusively say as a fact that Russian government and the Trump campaign were colluding with each other to, I don't have more pages there. Okay. Whoops. Let's see. No, it's just going on and on. Okay, here's another section. One of my oldest clients comes out of a classified section. One of my oldest clients, and I began working for Baker, I believe, in 2009 or 2010, and I've done a number of cases with them. And I generally provide litigation support, which is research, gathering documents, figuring out who to subpoena, and sometimes dealing with the witness and media and other things like that. I think the Prevezon matter was probably the fourth or fifth matter I've done with them. They're very serious, sober, reputable attorneys, and I like working with them. And so they approached me originally in late 2013 with this matter. I didn't know anything about Prevezon, didn't know anything about most of this stuff. Didn't know who Browder was, William Browder was. But in any event, the original issue that was presented to me was not really a Russia issue. It was it was like a technical question about money laundering, which was whether the government could possibly prove that money from some specific fraud in Russia went into these projects in New York, these real estate projects. So that's something that Fusion GPS started digging into, all the shady real estate deals. Let's see, this Airbank had, this is good. This is the Julian Assange thumb drive handoff, I guess. Quote, Airbank had a number of trips to the United States, and there was sort of that there's been a misrepresentation of the length of that relationship and the extent of it. I've told and have not confirmed that Nigel Farage had additional trips to the Ecuadorian embassy than the one that's been in the papers, and that he provided data to Julian Assange. Mr. Schiff, what kind of data? Mr. Simpson, a thumb drive. Mr. Schiff, thumb drive, thank you. There was a time is up in there. What kind of data? Time is up. Can I just get an answer? A thumb drive, thank you. Okay, process question there. And here's where I think it gets into why did you go public with it? I want to make sure, this is a congressman, I want to make sure we're not waiving other privileges that we've asserted in this investigation as well, including the First Amendment, but cut off. And my last question for you, Mr. Simpson, is why did you go to direct Mr. Steele to go to the media with the information in the Steele dossier? Answer. Sure. Well, so there were these two instances of this, or rounds of it, and I think I was beginning to recount this earlier. In whatever the first round was, I assume it was sometime mid-September or early October, it was mainly about telling the press, a few high-level members of the national security press, and the, top-level press, that we had information. There was a Russian intelligence operation, and that the Russians were engaged in, that this was more than just hacking, and that there was a major effort to interfere with the election, and that it allegedly involved the Trump organization. And the reason for that, the motivation for that, was mainly because I thought that this was historic, and that it was something the press needed to investigate and know about and ask the intelligence community about. ... And so, anyway, so we wanted people to know. And we were also of the view, by the point, we'd been doing research for 2+ months. We were of the view that there was really something here, that this was really bad, and that there was some serious allegations that it just wasn't Russians. It was Russians working with Americans. So that was round one, he continued. Then, and indeed, no one ran off and wrote a big story about how a British spy thinks about, the Russians are working with the Trump people. Come the end of October, this is Mr. Simpson, Fusion GPS. Come the end of October, some extraordinary things started happening. The Russians, WikiLeaks releases John Podesta's emails, and then, most extraordinary of all, James Comey sends a letter to Congress saying he's reopening the Hillary Clinton email investigation. And that was, I believe, around the 25th. And, if you're me, and you've been in politics and campaigns and investigations, and this is your whole world, and you've been doing it basically since you got out of college, one of the things that that is really ingrained in you is the rules of Washington. And when I say rules, I mean like regulations of the Justice Department about interfering with the election. It's not something that you're just aware of as a technical requirement. It's something that people embrace, which is the law that law enforcement shouldn't interfere in elections by announcing investigations of people at the last minute. I think that's called the Byrd Rule. This is me, my commentary. I think that's called the Byrd Rule. For like 90 days beforehand, unless something really happens or whatever, they're not supposed to. Okay, I'm going back to the reading again. And we're okay. So something that law enforcement shouldn't interfere. I'm going back to his to Mr. Simpson Fusion GPS testimony. Shouldn't interfere in elections by announcing investigations of people last minute. And so we were shocked and felt. I mean, I guess I was angry. ... So at that point, I, of course, was really confused. And I would say Chris was a little scared because he thought that he didn't really understand what was going on with the FBI. In any event, at that point, I felt like the rules had just been thrown out and that Comey had violated the sort of one of the more sacrosanct policies, which is not announcing law enforcement activity in the closing days of an election. And so we began talking to the press again about, we decided that if James Comey wasn't going to tell people about the investigation, that, he had violated the rules, and we would only be fair if the world knew that both candidates were under FBI investigation. Okay, it goes away again. Here we go. Sorry, I'm just taking a quick moment here to go over the yadity stuff so I can get something good and interesting for you. Okay, I guess that was the first one. I think we haven't covered it all. This is Mr. Simpson, the Fusion GPS guy. Would be the Center for National Interest and the people involved around. Oh, he's talking about places other areas that haven't been uncovered yet, where there's sneaky stuff going on. The first one we haven't covered at all would be the Center for National Interest and the people involved with the Center for the National Interest. And among other things, well, importantly, Dmitry Simes is known in the Russian expat community as a suspected Russian agent, and I believe he's known to the FBI as a suspected Russian agent. And I think that you could develop more information in that area from talking to Russian intelligence defectors and people who came to this country and have been given refuge from Russian intelligence. There are a number of Russian defectors. There are a number of Russian defectors who, I think, maybe could speak to that. I think there are some records around that might reflect some of that. And I think that is, given their fundamental role in creating the Trump foreign policy, I think that was a really important idea. I think talking to Russian intelligence defectors in general about what they think was going on and what they'd heard is probably a useful thing to do. And I think, Manafort. This is regarding Manafort. I'm skipping ahead again. Regarding Manafort and the fact that he was Nixon related, I think. Quote, and I think he has a little more knowledge of Manafort's Ukrainian activities. And they both, he's brought in Stone at this point. Roger Stone. Stone was a protege of a Republican political fellow named Arthur Finkelstein, who worked with him on the Nixon campaign. And maybe it was Finkelstein, I think. And Finkelstein was one of the first consultants to really appreciate how to target voters in a way that somewhat resembles the way the Trump campaign and the Russians did. And he spent many years, Finkelstein worked with Stone and Manafort in Ukraine around 2005, 2006 for the same cast of bad guys. And later went off to Hungary to work for pro-Russian Prime Minister there, Viktor Orban, and went into business over there. And there's a lot of allegations coming out of the Hungarian expat community about all of that. And so I think that's an important area. That's one of the, we've picked up Hungary, is inside the EU, and essentially, Orban is essentially a Putin puppet, and the GRU has a big station there. There's a lot of unexplained travel by various people, and we've heard a lot of rumors about that and a lot of allegations since the beginning of last year. We're going back into Russia, Turkey here, I think. More activity there. The Turkey-Russia connection, I think, is deeper than generally understood. I think that the Turkey-Russia, I think that the influence campaign that General Flynn got caught up in is reflective of that. And I think it's not been excavated. And I think that Roger Stone may have connections to that matter that are unexplored. Schiff asks, why do you say that? Simpson replies, things I heard from sources. I think Ted Malloch is an important person to this whole picture. And he may have had some role in all of that. He's an interesting person who crosses over from Brexit, Trump, and the Turkey-related issue. And then the last thing I'd like to add is, we haven't talked about Deutsche Bank at all. I think they obviously know a fair bit, but they are obviously within your subpoena power, and I'm assuming you probably asked them to provide information. I think that's probably that's all I have sorted out of the system yet. I got to go back and read some more, but I thought it might be fun to share that little tidbit. And I hope you're having a great day.